Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for stopping by. Today, I want to share with you a hidden gem in the horror community. Some of you may have listened to him before, or even be subscribed to him. I'm of course speaking about the incredible Being Scared. Take a listen, and please check out his amazing channel. His originality and creativity never cease to amaze me. Once this video is over, remember to pop over and subscribe to his channel as well as check out his work. I know that you will be as impressed as I am. So without further ado, let's begin.
When I was in 8th grade, my parents separated. Basically, my mom packed her and I up one night, and we moved into my grandpa's and didn't look back. We ended up living there through my high school years. When he died, my parents officially got divorced. My mom remarried, and we moved into the city with my stepfather. My grandpa lived on the first floor of the apartment, and the owners, an elderly couple who were family to us through marriage, lived on the second floor. The property also had a small in-law cottage out in the back where my uncle lived. For some reason that I will never understand, there was no lock to get into the actual building if you entered through the back. The back door opened into a landing where there was a locked and deadbolted door to our apartment, and then 2 sets of stairs. One led up to the also locked and deadbolted door of the second floor apartment, and the other led down to the basement where there was also no lock. Our apartment could also be entered from the front of the building, but in order to access the second floor apartment or the basement, you had to go through this landing. The basement was actually pretty nice, and at one point they had started to convert it into its own apartment before they ultimately decided to make the in-law cottage instead. So in the basement, there was a full kitchen complete with an oven, a sink, and a refrigerator. The washer and dryer, which was shared by all of us, was also in the basement, as well as just some general storage stuff. The basement was entirely open except for a back room that was full of storage. It had one of those kind of swinging saloon type doors where you can see above and beneath them. The storage area was longer than it was deep, so you couldn't really see anything much behind the doors aside from shelves. You had to walk in them and turn to really see the room. One night when I was in high school, I think I was 15 at the time, after taking a shower, I saw that the laundry bin in the bathroom was pretty full, so I grabbed a ton of laundry and headed down towards the basement. It was pretty late at night, but I figured I would at least get it started and move some things over in the morning. I tossed everything onto the ground and started sorting out colors when I got hit with a horrible feeling in my gut. The basement was not at all a creepy basement. It was well lit and pretty welcoming with the kitchen and everything, but for some reason that I can't explain, something just started to feel wrong. Anyone who has ever been hit with the feeling that they were being watched knows exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know how or why it came over me, but it was something that I couldn't shake, and I found myself looking over the saloon doors and the only part of the basement that I couldn't see in its entirety. I don't know why, maybe just to assure myself I was being a big baby, I started to walk towards the back room, but stopped myself just as I reached out towards the swinging doors. I've been a horror fan for as long as I can remember, and had seen more horror movies than I could count, and I knew that if that was a movie, I would be calling myself a dumbass and saying not to go into that back room. I quickly snapped my hand back and ran up the stairs, leaving all the clothes behind, and into our apartment, where I locked the doors and immediately told my mom that I just had the worst feeling in the basement and that I was super creeped out. Despite me not being the type of person that scares easily, she basically rolled her eyes at me and told me to go to bed. I ended up doing as I was told, though it took me a bit to shake the feeling and finally fall asleep. Later that night, my bladder woke me up and I stumbled out of my room to go to the bathroom. I didn't turn any of the lights on as I started making my way towards the bathroom because it usually woke up my grandpa and I didn't want to bother him. When I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed my mom standing in the doorway of her bedroom, and something looked off, and it took me a moment to realize that she was clutching the phone. She then noticed me and whispered to me to get against the wall, which I did without hesitation. It took a few moments for the grogginess to wear off and my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I could see what she did. My mom's bedroom was immediately off of the kitchen. The kitchen was where the back door that led to the landing and the basement was located. The door had a tiny window up top with a small but thick curtain. It was thin enough that you could see that someone was outside of the door, but thick enough to not be able to make out any of the features of the person on the other side. But there was someone on the other side of the door, and every now and then the doorknob would move and you could hear this scratching sound was on the other side. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm not sure how I managed to do what I did next. It was like someone else had taken control over me entirely. I slid down against the wall that I was clinging to and started to crawl against it in the darkness towards the kitchen. My mom looked petrified, watching back and forth between me and the back door. She kept whispering for me to stop and go back, but I kept moving forward, low and against the wall, towards the counter where I carefully grabbed a butcher knife. I was shaking the whole time I moved, with the knife in my hand on the ground next to the fridge, which was next to the door the man was trying to get into. I had this horrible feeling that I was going to be killed, but if I wasn't going to go down without a fight. It felt like I sat there forever in the darkness, next to the door with my mom hiding in the bedroom doorway across from me, just waiting. But it was only for a few minutes. My mom had already called 911 before I had woken up and stumbled my way towards the bathroom. The lights from approaching squad cars soon filled the kitchen, and from the other side of the door, I could hear a sudden clamoring and commotion and the slam of the back screen bursting open as the would-be assailant took off running. It was around 3 a.m. when this happened, so it was completely dark outside, and we lived right by some train tracks and very thick bushes and trees that made it easy for the man to escape the cop that pursued him. The police came in and took statements from my mom and I. My grandpa, who was partially deaf, had managed to sleep through almost the entire thing until the police came through to search the apartment and make sure that we were okay. The outside of the door and the doorknob were both covered in deep scratches, like someone had been going at it with a knife, trying to figure out how to get in, but that wasn't the most horrifying part to me. That was reserved for the basement. The clothes that I had brought down were not where I had left them, and they had been thrown about and disheveled, and the back room, the one with the swinging door that I had stopped myself from going in, the boxes that were out of view had also been thrown about, all opened, obviously gone through, with some things missing, and there were some wrappers from food on the floor. He had been down there looking for something to steal. He was down there when I went down to do laundry. I had almost walked into that room, and based on what we had seen on the door, he had a knife. To this day, I can't help but find myself sometimes thinking about what would have happened if I had walked into that room. When I was a kid, my dad would always take me to this one specific beach to go fishing. I loved it so much that even when I grew up, I continued to go there, sometimes with my friends, and sometimes alone. This story happened when I was alone. I backed my truck up to the water, released my boat, parked my truck up at the top of the ramp, and I headed out. It was a beautiful day, but a bit overcast. I enjoyed the occasional nap while out on the water, and today I needed one. I kicked my feet up and I put my head back. I must have fell into a pretty deep sleep, because when I woke up, my boat was still floating peacefully. But to my horror, there was another boat right next to mine. I stood up in surprise and saw that there was another fisherman sitting on his boat in a chair, looking at me. He was older than me, maybe in his 50s. He had long brown hair that was slicked back, and honestly, he looked like bad news. He gave me a weird smile and said, "Rise and shine." I nervously chuckled and told him I didn't mean to doze off and I had to be on my way. My heart started to pound when the guy said, "Nope." But he didn't move from his chair. I got up and started the motor on my boat and drove away. I have no idea why he said nope to me when I told him I had to leave. I have no idea why he just sat there and let me leave. But damn, that was so nerve-wracking. When I was around 10 years old, my family took a trip to Egypt. It was a sorta half cruise down the Nile. We would stay often in various spots to check out things, and I don't think we honestly actually traveled on the boat very far. It's where our rooms were though. My memory is a bit shaky on the finer points, as it was almost 20 years ago. But I do remember lots of the cool things we went to see and do. The Great Pyramids, riding a camel, museums, mummies, etc. But I also remember a lot of not so fun things, like the tour guide telling my family that my mother and I could never be by ourselves without either our male family members or others from the tour group. They told us that the men in the country would see a single woman as someone seeking sex, as they wouldn't travel alone otherwise. Or the man offering my father a herd of camels for me, and a bit less for my mother, as she was older. On the top of the ship we were staying at, there was a swimming pool. One morning as I was using it, sporting a one-piece bathing suit, there was a boat driving past where we were moored, full of men. They were hooting and hollering, applauding, and making a general ruckus as they could see me, and I put on theatrics because of it, diving into the pool, strutting around, loving the attention. I cringe at this now. Years later, my mother told me how in a store selling souvenirs on shore, she was groped by the seller. He was placing a necklace on her and gave one of her breasts a really invasive feel. She told my father and he shrugged it off at the time, and she was still mad at him over it. I understand. I would too. Good job, Dad. Not. And to this day I remember the one morning my parents went to go watch the sunrise over the desert. It required a very early wake-up, and my brother and I declined to go. So while my parents were out in the desert looking at the sun, my brother still sleeping, I decided to go to the pool. This may have been the same day that I was catcalled, since I was at the pool area by myself, but I'm not 100% sure. I do remember that on the top of the ship, there was a hatch going down one level near the pool. That day I eyed it and decided I had to know where it went. It was easy to open, and I climbed down a short ladder to the deck below. This deck was still open to the outside, with doors leading to compartments and such. The way the boat was moored, we were a couple of ships out from the port. To get off the boat, you'd have to traverse the other ships in between, but I think this was a normal thing. They were all lined up together, and the travelers would simply disembark by going through the various ships until reaching shore. I went right when I reached the ladder bottom, noticing the major differences from the other areas of the boat I had been on. This area was dirtier, and there were ropes and other junk lying around. I found where the kitchens were, and I stood a while looking through the window. I remember it seemingly rather gross looking in there, which redoubled my desire to never eat there. My family had already decided to not eat on the boat when a waiter visibly sweated into the soups he served us. I went back towards where the ladder was, then continued a bit to the left. From this vantage, I could see all the ships between ours and shore. I think there were around 3 to 4 in total. I noticed on the far ship that a man was hopping over the railings and coming towards me, one boat at a time. This is Verse coming through the main area, which had been set up for the tourists to easily get through all the ships to get to shore. I backed up a bit, back towards the ladder as I realized he was making a beeline toward me. He came over the railing and I don't remember what exactly he said to me, but it was an introduction in heavily accented English. He asked me if I wanted to party. I was a little confused. In my head, party is when my parents had friends over and lots of music and dancing. I liked parties. Sometimes I got to stay up late and dance too. I don't remember exactly how he convinced me, but I remember standing in the open doorway to the cabin where he was inviting me in. It smelled like smoke, and there was a haze all throughout the room. 3 men in the traditional garb, I don't know what it's called, the long flowing dress like shirts that they wear, with the headgear as well, were sitting and smiling at me, waving their hands at me. A hookah nearby them. Bottles everywhere. Outside the room the sun was shining and everything was bright and lit up, and there was an underlying smell I couldn't place, smoke drifting, and the blinds were all shut, giving the room a reddish tinge. Out of everything, that memory is the most vivid. I remember looking up at the smiling mustached man standing in the doorway. He wasn't intimidating, a bit scrawny. He had a good smile that didn't seem off. My little prepubescent brain didn't light up though. It went, I'm pretty sure this is one of those situations that I'm not supposed to be in, and I really need to go. Right the heck now. So I booked it. I turned tail, skedaddled to the ladder. It wasn't that far. I didn't look back a single time, just got up the ladder as fast as I could and ran back to our room. My brother was in, where he was still sleeping. I told my parents after they returned. They made a complaint, but nothing ever came of it. The room in question was just a crew member's lounge or something. I never saw any of those guys again. My parents left Egypt disgruntled. I never really thought about it again until a few years later when I was older. Would I be dead by now? Sold into a sex ring? Married to some Egyptian guy with a bunch of kids by now? It makes me shudder to even think about it, and very grateful that my school did cover a little, not enough, about stranger danger. It was enough to make me reject the very friendly guy and realize this was a bad situation for me to be in. With all the weird situations that happened on that trip, and the fascination I apparently held for being so young, I can't help but think that something terrible would have happened if I had gone into that room. Skeeves me out to this day. My friend and I were on a vacation with our wives. The wives stayed on the beach one day, while my friend and I got on a party boat and headed out into the ocean over the waves. There were about 6 other people on the boat with us, all of us non-stop smiling and having a blast. The driver of the boat was very cool, but you couldn't really understand his English. At one point, some people on the boat wanted to stop so they could take a dip. We ended up stopping, and all of us jumped into the water. My friend and I jumped off the boat to the right, and the rest of the people to the left. While splashing and laughing, suddenly, everyone on the other side of the boat started screaming. We couldn't climb back onto the boat fast enough, and when we did, we looked over the edge to the other side and saw the water was bright red, and one of the people were gone. Somehow, everyone claims they didn't see anything at all. The woman that disappeared never turned up, and it was the most insane thing that I've ever seen. on a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay with about 7 other men doing a shakedown test cruise, planned to be out for about 12 hours. Mid-1980s, not as reliable weather prediction resources. We get caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50-mile-per-hour range. Just this short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails because the one fellow on board, who was the best sailor, sensed the storm was almost on us. Otherwise, we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a Securite call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, but then it passed. We would live. This was about 3 p.m., and although there was cloud cover of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 miles or so in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallower depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things of the sea floor. The siding. We're all on deck, working lines, checking damage, etc. And the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often use the saying, "The sea is confused." I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, then submerges again. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man, a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, then dove back under. So maybe you need to know a few things about me at the moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had, at the time, about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, etc., all around the world. I was not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything. What could I say? I just saw a strange creature. Take my word for it. The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D, skipper, or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked onto the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years experience in the surface navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes and then went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. No one else said that they had seen it. Then we sailed back to the pier later that day and didn't speak of it again. My parents divorced when I was around 1 year old, and my mom decided to go to college shortly after we moved into our own tiny house. My mom didn't have those crazy party years, as she got pregnant with me relatively young, so she saw this as her opportunity to do so. Usually, my grandparents or her best friend would watch me on the nights she would go have fun, but sometimes there was no one available, and my mom would throw small parties at our place instead. I don't remember most of these, just small flashes here and there of our crowded living room and kitchen, or Salt and Peppa songs blasting in the backyard. My mom had this guy friend, we'll call him Jeremy, who came to every party. I loved Jeremy, and my mom did too, partly because he was gay and she never felt threatened by him, and partly he also adored me. I was a 3-year-old girl obsessed with anything Disney princess, and every time I saw Jeremy, he would bring me anything cheap and Disney princess related. Anything from these growing sponges to crayons. This, of course, meant I trusted and loved Jeremy. He would call me chicken legs, which to a 3-year-old was hilarious and insulting at the same time, since everyone had always said I was a really skinny kid. However, I delighted in the little nickname when he used it, and would only answer to that when he came around. One day, during the summer, my mom was hosting a small barbecue, and Jeremy had come over early to help prepare. It was just the 3 of us, and my mom told me she remembered Jeremy constantly checking his watch. She wrote it off as he was just making sure everything would be ready on time. But around 5 o'clock, Jeremy suddenly pulled me into his arms, saying I was being a bit fussy and wanted some juice. My mom hadn't noticed I was being fussy, and to this day swears I had been happily playing on my own. She says Jeremy took me inside, through the front door, and out into the front yard where another car was waiting, without missing a beat. I trusted Jeremy, but to this day, I'm so thankful that I started screaming my head off as the passenger door opened. Jeremy proceeded to shove me inside when my mother came rushing through the front door. My mother is not one to be fucked with. She's the toughest woman I know, and in every essence, she is the mother bear. She came barreling out of the front door and charged across the lawn. Jeremy saw this and froze, pulling me from the car just as it sped off. My mom proceeded to ask him what the fuck he was doing. She already knew, but Jeremy fed her some bullshit of taking me to the store real quick because we were out of juice. He said I had agreed to go, and he thought it was fine since they were friends. Mom snatched me away and told him to get the fuck out of there and to never come back. You don't just take someone's kid without telling them. She never wanted to see him near her or me ever again. I never saw Jeremy after that, but I didn't understand why. I asked about him a few times after that, but of course, eventually forgot, as toddlers often do. I don't know what instinct told me to scream, as I had thought of Jeremy as a family member, but I'm so glad I did. Wherever Jeremy was planning on taking me, there was no way it could have been good, and some sick part of me wonders if my pet name had anything to do with that destination. This story takes place in the year 1912 in a little Iowa farming community named Valicia. One summer day, my great-grandmother was asked if she would like to stay overnight at her friend's house with 2 other girls. When my great-grandmother asked her parents if she could attend the sleepover, she was told that she couldn't, as there was too much housework that needed to be done, but that she could go over the next day after her morning chores had been completed. The next morning, my great-grandmother's friend, her siblings, her parents, and the 2 guests who were staying overnight were found murdered. Police discovered that all 8 people had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe, was left in the house. The murder has never been solved. To this day, my family's unofficial motto is "Saved by Chores." And yes, this story is used in my family to scare children into completing their housework. I grew up in a pretty low-income town outside of a major US city. I never really had any friends until college, so in high school, it was just me and my girlfriend who lived in the same building as me. One night, just before Halloween, I had knocked on my girlfriend's door to see if she wanted to go for a walk with me. I had just rolled a joint and thought it would be cool to check out our town all lit up and spooky, but to my disappointment she wasn't feeling well and decided to call it an early night. So I decided to go it alone, and this wasn't the first time either, so I didn't have any speculation about it. It was about 12:30 a.m. when I got about a block down the road. I was well into my smoke and had just passed the last row of houses when I heard a noise coming from the alleyway. Like every time I'm baked, I assume it's a policeman and I speed walk into the tree line in front of me. When I did, under the dank glow of the streetlight there was an old man in a plaid suit and a bowler hat. He honestly looked like a cardboard cutout because he didn't move an inch, and even from about 15 yards away I could see his face. It was a bit shadowed from his hat, but I could make out a large grin on his face. It looked painfully forced and he looked diagonally into the cold night sky. As I stared down the sky from behind the shrubbery, his gaze suddenly fixated itself on the tree line where I was, and I stayed there frozen, wondering what the hell was going on. I've seen my fair share of crackheads and drug addicts, but this guy looked utterly insane. I just hoped to God that he wasn't looking at me. Something deep down in my gut told me to keep your distance from him, and in that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my fingers. I looked down. The joint burned to the mouthpiece and it was now cooking my fingertips. I let out a loud slur and quickly dropped the joint on the ground. Still in pain, I refocused my attention on the street corner where the man was. I guess my commotion bothered him because he began slowly walking in the opposite direction in a strange, on-a-wire-like stride. I took a deep breath, collected myself and exited the woods. The man was out of sight and I listened, his steps fading very gradually into the night. I sat down on the nearest stoop and pulled out a cigarette to calm my nerves, but before I could even light the damn thing, I hear in the dark street ahead of me quick footsteps and a voice. No, 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 no. And there he was, running straight at me, his face cocked into a crooked angle, screaming. I dropped all of my shit and just ran. I have never run so fast in my life. I didn't bother looking back, and when I got to my building, I shut the door and ran upstairs. Like a kid after a scary movie, I went straight to my room and locked the door behind me. I checked out the window. Everything seemed normal until I heard the familiar tapping of his dress shoes. Not a moment later, he was there, in front of my building. The man looked up at me and took off his cap as he was saying hello. He then put his cap back on and walked toward my building door. The angle I was at was incapable of seeing people at the front steps, but that wasn't necessary, because soon enough I heard the door downstairs being opened and a slow but heavy step making its way up the stairs. My door handle jiggled, and I began sweating bullets. I looked out the window to think of how to escape, but this was pointless. I was 3 stories high. I ran to the door and held it with all my strength. Needless to say, I have never been so terrified in my life. After only a few seconds, the door stopped moving, and I collapsed in front of the door in exhaustion, drifting off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up in my bed with the door wide open. I jumped when I woke up, because from the point I fell asleep to when I woke up felt like a millisecond. Everything was normal. The sun was up, and I could smell breakfast downstairs. I went outside to have another smoke, and on my way down, I had convinced myself that it was a dream. That was until I opened the door and saw a bowler cap on the doorsteps to my apartment. I call him the gentleman. I work night security at a mall. My first Christmas, being the new guy, I got stuck with the early morning shift. After staying awake all night, I had about 30 minutes left when the phone rings. I'm feeling pretty groggy, but the ringing clears my head. As I put the phone up to my head to answer it, I see a person standing in front of me about 60 feet down the hall. Now at this point, the mall had been empty since midnight the night before. There wasn't supposed to be anyone there but me. I answer the phone with the usual greeting out of habit, but all I'm really doing is watching this person walk slowly towards me. The person on the phone is from the alarm monitoring station. I had the alarm set the whole night, and they casually start to tell me that we have an alarm going off at our location. Normally, when an alarm goes off, it's a false alarm or a broken sensor, so the lady on the line isn't reacting with any kind of urgency. But when she starts to ask if I want her to dispatch the police, I tell her, I'm looking at the guy right now. After this, everything happened all at once. Immediately, the guy stops walking, and I realize that he didn't know I was there until just then. The lady on the phone says she is going to send the police and transfers me directly to a police dispatch operator. I stand up and yell at the top of my lungs, "Hey!" Maybe not the most eloquent thing I could have said, but I was tired, and that's when I realized that this guy was closer to the exit than I was. If he got there first, he could stop me from getting out. I don't have a gun, or a taser, or anything. If this guy had a weapon of any kind, he would have an advantage over me. My mind starts to race through the options I have when the guy does the last thing I was expecting and starts sprinting away from me, back the way he came. Policy for night security where I work says that we shouldn't pursue or confront an intruder. We're supposed to go somewhere safe so we can continue to provide access and information to responding police. But as this guy starts to turn the corner is when I realize that now I have an intruder in the mall, and I don't know where he is. That's when police dispatch gets back on the phone. I grab the only thing I can think to use as a weapon, the night security mag light. I start down the hall telling the police all the info I have and which door to go to so they can get in, holding the mag light like a club the whole time. By the time I get to the corner where I last saw the intruder, the cops are already at the door. I let them in and they take over like a SWAT team, guns out and angles covered. I figured they've got the guy cornered because there aren't any exits in that area of the mall. After a while, I get a call from my replacement to come open the door so they can get in. The police are still there searching, but not finding anything. No open doors, no broken windows, no loose gates, no intruder. I update the next guard on what happened and get out as soon as I can. I get home and try to get some sleep before I go to spend Christmas with my family. Instead, I spent the next few hours tossing and turning, thinking about people hiding in the dark corners of my room. When I got to my parents' house, I relaxed a little and caught a little nap. But then later that night, I had to go back to the mall for another night shift. Spent the whole night with all the lights on and the mag light at the ready. They never found the guy, or how he got in or out. My grandparents decided to take the whole family on a cruise at Christmas time around the Caribbean. There were 14 of us, so we were all located in different cabins spread over different floors. I'm a female, so my sister and myself shared a room. I was 16 and my sister was 14. On our first night, we could hardly sleep as the couple in the adjoining cabin were having a very loud argument. The man kept calling the girl a whore and shouted that she was only there because of his money. It went on until the early hours of the morning. After that night, all was quiet, and I assumed that the girl had moved to another cabin, as I never seen or heard her again. The next day we were up early for breakfast. I was keen to explore the ship, and my sister was taking a while to get ready. I thought if I waited in the corridor that I would encourage her to hurry up. While I was waiting in the corridor, I heard the next door opening, and I couldn't help but look to see who the man was that had been doing all of the shouting. He looked at me and his eyes lit up straight away. This horrible feeling came over me, the feeling I now know is gut instinct. I just knew from the way that he looked at me that he was bad news. He looked to be in his 40s and looked normal, but I couldn't stop the shivers traveling up my spine. He said hello, but all I could manage was a faint smile. I decided I'd head back into the room as I was chapping on the door. The man was walking down the corridor to the elevators, but repeatedly looked back to look at me. From that point on, he seemed to be everywhere. In the dining room at lunch, he would sit close by. At the pool, he would only be a few loungers along. A couple of times I got in elevators only to have him run in behind me, even though I hadn't seen him around before I entered the lift. Luckily, even though I wasn't with my family, there had always been other people in the lift when he ran in. All he did was stand and stare at me, and I would get shivers down my back. The first couple of days I tried to ignore it. I had always gotten attention from boys. I tried to just brush it off as a bit of attention, but something didn't seem right. Especially since the ship we were on was massive, and there was so many people on board. I started to find it hard to believe that he would just randomly bump into me. We had told my mom and dad and the others about the argument in the other room from the first night, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything about the man following me. I felt embarrassed. Silly, I know. Near the end of the week, I wanted to leave the pool and get changed to go watch a movie with my cousins. My sister wanted to stay at the pool, so I headed to the room by myself. When I got in the elevator with another few people, I noticed the man sneak in at the end, and all I could feel was dread as he stared at me. The other people on the lift got off at our stop, but went in another direction. As I walked down the corridor to my room, I could feel the man's eyes on the back of my neck. I quickly sped up and hurried into my room. A minute passed, and there was a knock at my door. Immediately, I knew it was him. There had been no one else in the corridor. The knocks continued as I panicked on what I should do. I thought I would have to answer the door because he had watched me enter and knew I was there. I answered the door, and the man had the creepiest smile on his face. "Hey, sweet thing. I'm locked out of my room. Can I come in to use your phone?" I knew he was lying, so quickly I thought of something to get out of the situation. "Sorry, our phone isn't working," I said as I tried to shut the door. "Oh fuck, you're Scottish?" he asked in a surprised voice. I mumbled something in agreement, shutting the door, but he stuck his foot in. I decided to use all my strength and batter the door against his foot. He cried out in pain, but put his other foot in place. "Hey, I just need to come in for a minute," he kept shouting at me. I told him he should just go to reception and continued to try to shut the door. The panic was flooding through me. The next minute I heard someone say, "Jess, what's going on?" With relief, I realized it was my older male cousin, Jonathan, coming by so we could go watch the film. "Who are you?" Jonathan shouted at the man. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were Scottish. I thought I knew your friend from back in the US, the guy mumbled. "It's just a misunderstanding." He hopped away and proceeded to enter his room. We left the next morning, and I didn't see him again. I will never forget that creepy expression he had on his face every time he looked at me. It makes me sick to my stomach.